Let us look at a story of hatred converting to immense amount of love.
Nobody in Caldwell Creek talked about the Gerald Westbrook arrangement out loud. They whispered about it the way people whisper about a wound that hasn't fully healed, carefully, and only when the person wasn't in earshot. What they all seemed to agree on, without ever saying it plainly, was that Clayton Harrell had walked into that church looking like a man heading to his own hanging. What none of them could agree on was why. By the following spring, he started walking a little differently. But Clayton was 31 years old and had spent the better part of a decade building the Harrell Ranch back from nothing. His father, Edmund Harrell, had drunk most of the land's value away before the consumption took him, and Clayton had inherited little more than a broken fence line, a tired old horse, and a name that still carried some weight in the county, if only barely. He'd worked himself lean and quiet over those years. He didn't socialize much. He didn't court anyone. And he told himself he didn't have time, and for a while that was true enough. The trouble started with a debt. Not his debt, as it happened, but one that had his name tangled up in it all the same. Edmund Harrell, in one of his final desperate moves, had borrowed a considerable sum from Gerald Westbrook, the most established landowner in the county, using a verbal agreement and a signed note that promised repayment within 5 years of Edmund's death. That Clayton had never known about the note until Gerald Westbrook rode up to his fence line one afternoon with a copy of it in his hand and a calm look on his face that was somehow worse than anger. "I don't want your land, Clayton," Gerald had said, folding the note back into his coat pocket. "I want security, and I want my daughter settled." Clayton had stood very still for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass around them. His jaw tightened. "Rosalind is a fine woman," Gerald continued, as though he were discussing the weather. "She's 26, and she's particular. Most men around here don't suit her, and frankly, she doesn't suit them. But you're steady. You're not a drinker. And this arrangement would clear your father's debt entirely." Clayton looked out at his land, at the fence he'd mended post by post, at the cattle grazing in the far pasture. He thought about what it would mean to lose it, and he thought about what it would mean to keep it this way. He didn't say yes that afternoon, but he didn't say no either. Rosalind Westbrook heard about the conversation from her father that same evening at supper. She set down her fork, listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then picked her fork back up and finished her meal. Her father watched her carefully, the way he always did when he couldn't read her. "You don't have anything to say?" he asked. "Not yet," she said, but she had plenty to say. She just didn't see the point in saying it to him. She knew of Clayton Harrell the way most people in Caldwell Creek knew of him, by reputation and by sight. He was the man who worked from first light to last, the man who nodded at you in town but didn't stop to talk. He wasn't unfriendly exactly. He was just sealed, like a jar that had been closed so long nobody remembered what was inside. Rosalind was not a woman who frightened easily, but she was honest enough with herself to admit that marrying a man who hadn't chosen her was not what she'd imagined for her life. She'd imagined, quietly, privately, something warmer than this, something chosen. She thought about it for 3 days before she went to see Clayton herself. He was mending a section of fence along the south pasture when she rode up. He straightened slowly when he saw her, pulling off one work glove and then the other. He looked at her the way you look at something you're not sure how to categorize. "Miss Westbrook," he said. "Mr. Harrell." She dismounted without waiting for help and stood a few feet from him in the afternoon dust. "I want to be straightforward with you." "All right," he said. "I don't want a husband who resents me," she said. "And I don't imagine you want a wife who makes your life harder than it already is. So if we're going to do this, and it seems like we might be, I think we should at least be honest with each other from the start." Clayton looked at her for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly, more like the beginning of surprise. "That's fair," he said finally. It wasn't much, but it was the first real thing he'd said to her, and Rosalind recognized the difference. And they were married 6 weeks later on a Tuesday morning, with 12 people in attendance. Clayton said his vows in a steady voice with his jaw set and his eyes forward. Rose said hers quietly, looking directly at him. He didn't look back. Not yet. The first few weeks of marriage were polite in the way that a cold morning is polite. Not unpleasant exactly, just not warm. Clayton had given Rosalind the larger of the 2 bedrooms in the ranch house and moved his own things into the smaller one without discussion. She hadn't asked him to. He hadn't explained it. It was simply done, and she understood it for what it was. A man drawing a boundary the only way he knew how, quietly and with his hands instead of his words. She didn't push against it. The house itself was clean, but sparse. Yet Clayton had never had reason to make it comfortable beyond what function required. There were no curtains on the windows. The table had 2 chairs, but only one of them had ever been used regularly. She could tell by the way the legs had worn into the floorboards. The kitchen had everything necessary and nothing extra. Rosalind didn't rearrange things the first week. She watched instead. She was good at that. She noticed that Clayton was up before sunrise every morning without exception, and that he took his coffee black and standing at the kitchen window, and that he was always back inside by sundown, regardless of how much work remained undone. She noticed that he fed the dogs before he fed himself. She noticed that he kept a small, worn Bible on the windowsill of the front room, but never opened it in front of her. She noticed that he was lonely in a way he had probably stopped recognizing. By the second week, she had put curtains on the kitchen window. Simple ones, cream-colored, nothing extravagant. Clayton came in from the morning chores and stopped when he saw them. He stood there for just a moment, coffee cup in hand, looking at the window. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look displeased either. He sat down at the table, in his usual chair, and drank his coffee. A few mornings later, there were 2 chairs with worn legs. The nearest thing to a real conversation they had in those early weeks happened by accident, the way most real conversations do. Clayton had come in late one evening after a difficult day. One of his mares had taken sick, and he'd spent the better part of the afternoon with her, uncertain of the outcome. He was tired and quieter than usual, which was saying something. Rosalind had kept his supper warm without being asked. He sat down and ate without speaking. She was mending something at the other end of the table, not paying him particular attention. Yet when he said without looking up, she might not make it. Rosalind looked up. "The mare?" He nodded once. "What happened?" He told her, not in great detail, but enough. A description of the symptoms, what he'd tried, what the outcome might be by morning. She listened without interrupting, without offering hollow reassurances. When he finished, she asked one question, a practical one, about something she'd seen her father's stable hand do in a similar situation years ago. Clayton looked at her with a kind of focused attention he hadn't shown her before. "That might help," he said slowly. "It might not," she said honestly. I don't know horses the way you do." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll try it." The mare survived. Clayton didn't make a great occasion of telling her, but he mentioned it the next morning at the kitchen window in the same tone he might use to report the weather. Rosalind nodded and refilled his coffee. It was a small thing, but small things were the only currency available to them at that point, and she was paying attention to everyone. Yet the first real friction came at the end of the first month, and it came, as friction often does, from something that had nothing to do with what it was actually about. A man named Douglas Pearson rode out to the ranch looking for Clayton on a Wednesday afternoon. Rosalind was the only one home. Pearson was a land agent, smooth-mannered and well-dressed in the way of men who made their living talking rather than working. But he said he had a standing interest in purchasing a portion of the Harrell South pasture and had been in conversation with Clayton about it for some time. Rosalind told him Clayton wasn't available and that he should come back. Pearson smiled in a way she didn't care for and said he was sure she could pass along the details just as well as anyone. She took the details. She passed them along that evening. Clayton's reaction was not what she expected. He went very still, set down his fork, and looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "You talked to Pearson," he said. "He came here," she said. "I couldn't very well turn him away without hearing what he wanted." "You could have," Clayton said. "This is my ranch. My land dealings are my business." The kitchen went quiet. Rosalind set her own fork down carefully. "I'm aware of that," she said, keeping her voice even. "I wasn't negotiating on your behalf, but I was being a civil person to a man who came to your door. He shouldn't have come to my door when I wasn't here." "Then perhaps you should tell him that," she said. "Not me." She got up and took her plate to the basin, and that was the end of the conversation. Clayton didn't apologize that night, but the following morning he said, without preamble, "Pearson's been pushing on that pasture for 2 years. I don't trust him. That's why I reacted the way I did." Rosalind looked at him. "That would have been useful information last night." He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. "It would have." It wasn't an apology, but from Clayton Harrell, she was beginning to understand. It was the closest thing. Her father came to visit at the 6-week mark, riding out on a Saturday with the air of a man conducting a quiet inspection. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and talked about ranch business with Clayton in a tone that was cordial but never quite comfortable. Rosalind moved around the kitchen and said little. Before he left, Gerald Westbrook pulled his daughter aside near the front porch. "You look well," he said, studying her. "I am well," she said. "Is he treating you right?" She considered the question honestly. "He's treating me fairly," she said. "That's where we are." Her father looked at her for a moment, then nodded. He seemed to want to say something more, but thought better of it, and mounted his horse instead. Rosalind watched him ride out and stood on the porch a moment longer than necessary. Clayton appeared in the doorway behind her. He didn't ask what they'd talked about. But later that evening, he did something he hadn't done before. He sat in the front room after supper instead of going straight to his room. He picked up the worn Bible from the windowsill, turned it over in his hands once, and set it back down. Then he looked at Rosalind, who was reading in the chair across the room. "Oh, do you play cards?" he asked. She looked up. "I do." "Any good?" "Better than I let on," she said. Something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one, the suggestion of it. He got up and found a worn deck of cards in the kitchen drawer and brought them back to the table. They played for an hour. He won twice. She won 3 times. He accused her of counting cards in a tone that wasn't quite serious, and she told him she didn't need to. And he looked at her across the table with that same focused attention she'd seen the night of the sick mare. This time, he held it a little longer before looking away. Rosalind gathered the cards and said goodnight and went to her room. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for a moment before lying down. She wasn't sure what was happening between them, but something was. Something slow and unannounced, the way a season changes, not all at once, but undeniably. And she closed her eyes and let herself wonder, just for a moment, where it might lead. Winter came to Caldwell Creek the way it always did, without much warning, and with a particular kind of cold that settled into the bones of old houses and older men alike. The Harrell ranch felt it early. The wind found every gap in the walls. The water trough froze before sunrise most mornings, and the days shortened until there was barely enough light to finish the necessary work before dark pulled everything closed. Clayton worked harder in winter than any other season. Rosalind had come to understand that about him. That stillness made him uneasy, that he needed the weight of effort the way some men needed drink. He wasn't running from anything exactly. He just didn't know how to be still without feeling like something was slipping. Since she had stopped trying to figure him out and started simply watching him live. There was a difference, she'd discovered. Figuring a person out meant looking for conclusions. Watching them live meant letting the picture form on its own. And the picture forming was not what she had expected when she'd ridden up to that fence line 6 months ago. The moment that changed something permanent between them happened on a Thursday evening in late November, and it began with nothing more dramatic than a broken stovepipe. The connector had rusted through, and the kitchen filled with smoke before either of them realized what was happening. Clayton was up on a chair trying to assess the damage, his face turned up toward the ceiling, when Rosalind climbed up beside him on the same chair to hold the lantern closer to where he was working. They were standing closer than they had ever stood, and she could feel the cold still coming off his coat from being outside. He worked in silence for a moment, and then said quietly, "Hold it a little to the left." She adjusted the lantern. Their hands were inches apart. "I can fix this tonight," he said. "It'll take a while." "I'll stay up," she said. He glanced at her briefly. Not a long look, just a check, the way you glance at something to confirm it's still there. Then he went back to work. She stayed up. She made coffee and brought him a cup without being asked, and sat at the table while he worked, and they talked in the loose, unhurried way of people who have run out of reasons to be formal with each other. He told her about the winter his father had let the pipes freeze, and how he'd spent 2 weeks hauling water from the creek by hand at 14 years old. She told him about the winter she'd spent 3 months nursing her mother through a fever that the doctor hadn't expected her to survive. She survived," Rosalind said. "Clearly," Clayton said, from up on the chair. "You get that from her? The stubborn part?" She looked up at him. "What stubborn part?" He gave her a look that was unmistakably dry. "The part where you don't quit." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Yes, I think I do." He finished the repair just past midnight. Yet he climbed down from the chair and tested the pipe and stood back and looked at it, with the particular satisfaction of a man who fixes things with his hands. Then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, "for staying up." "You would have managed without me," she said. "Probably," he agreed. And then, after a pause, "But it was better with you here." He said it simply, without apparent awareness of what it meant. Yet he picked up his coffee cup and drank the last of it and set it in the basin, and said goodnight. Rosalind sat at the table for a long moment after his door closed, her hands wrapped around her own cup, looking at nothing in particular. It was better with you here. She made herself not read too much into it, but she kept it, the way you keep a small, smooth stone you find on a path, not because it's valuable, just because something made you pick it up. Christmas came and went quietly. Clayton had ridden into town and come back with a small package wrapped in brown paper that he'd left on the kitchen table without ceremony or explanation. Inside was a pair of good leather gloves, well made and clearly not inexpensive. Rosalind had looked at them for a long moment before putting them on. They fit perfectly. She had gotten him something too, a new Bible, the same size as the worn one on the windowsill, but with clean pages and a proper binding. That she'd left it beside his coffee cup on Christmas morning. He'd picked it up and turned it over carefully, the way he handled things he valued. "You noticed the old one," he said. It's held together with hope, she said. He almost smiled. The shape was fully there this time, unmistakable at the corners of his mouth. He set the new Bible on the windowsill next to the old one and left them both there, side by side. She never asked why he kept both. She thought she understood. But the real test came in January. Clayton had ridden out early on a morning that had started cold and turned dangerous, one of those winter days on the frontier that shifts without warning from manageable to life-threatening. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped severely, and the wind had picked up into something serious. 2 of his ranch hands came back in without him, having lost track of him in the conditions while checking the far north fence line. Rosalind stood on the porch and looked at the sky and felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the weather. She didn't panic. Panic was loud and useless. Instead, she went inside, put on her heaviest coat and the leather gloves Clayton had given her at Christmas, and told the ranch hand named Albert to saddle 2 horses. Albert looked at her with the uncertainty of a man who wasn't sure whose authority to follow. "Now please," she said. Her voice was steady. They rode out together into the gray afternoon, following the fence line north. The wind was brutal, and the light was flat and wrong, the kind of light that makes distances deceptive. Albert called out periodically. Rosalind watched the ground for tracks and found them. Clayton's horse, moving in an irregular pattern that told her something had happened. They found him 1.5 miles out. His horse had thrown a shoe on frozen ground and stumbled, and Clayton had come down hard. He was on his feet when they reached him, but moving carefully. One hand pressed to his side, at his face drawn in a way she had never seen it. He looked up when he heard the horses, and something shifted in his expression. Relief, quickly controlled, quickly covered. "Didn't need rescuing," he said, which was so entirely Clayton that she almost laughed. "Of course not," she said, bringing her horse alongside him. "I was just out for a ride." He looked at her for a moment. Then he took her offered hand and let her help him mount. He'd cracked 2 ribs, but the doctor confirmed it 2 days later and told him what he already knew. Rest, limited movement, weeks of recovery. Clayton received this information with the expression of a man being told something deeply inconvenient and personally offensive. He thanked the doctor in a flat tone and said very little on the ride home. Rosalind managed the ranch with Albert and the other hand for the following weeks. She didn't ask Clayton's permission. She asked his advice. Every evening, as sitting at the edge of his doorway, while he rested against the headboard with the new Bible open in his lap. She told him what had been done and what still needed doing, and he told her what he would have done. Sometimes she did it his way. Sometimes she didn't, and told him why, and he listened with the particular attention of a man who was slowly learning that listening cost him nothing. One evening, near the end of the 3rd week, he said, "Without looking up from the Bible, you ran this place well." "Don't sound so surprised," she said from the doorway. "I'm not surprised," he said. He looked up then. "I mean it." She held his gaze for a moment. There was something different in the way he was looking at her now. Not the checking glance, not the measuring look. Something more open. Something that hadn't been there the day he'd stood at that church altar with his jaw set and his eyes forward. Yet she said goodnight and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed. And this time, when she wondered where this was going, she wasn't uncertain. She thought she knew. She thought he was getting there too, slowly, in the way of a man who had been sealed up so long he'd forgotten he could open. But he was getting there. And Rosalind Westbrook, Rosalind Harrell, she reminded herself, was patient enough to wait. She had always known that the best things arrived quietly.